I needed a place that I could put my boots on in the morning and pick out a good book at night. So I built a boot-putting, book-picking cabinet. Stay tuned so you can see how I did it and learn from my mistakes. I knew from day one this was going to be a painted cabinet. So I went with Baltic birch ply. I love it. It's very stable, flat, and it's good stuff to work with. For design, I wanted to keep things really simple. I like the shaker style. It fits really well in my house, and I sort of follow that as a inspiration, I would say. The bottom section I knew was going to be a bench, and I closed it off, kept it so that I can use it for storage because I always need an area to put blankets and pillows and wrapping paper and that kind of stuff. Plenty of area for books. I can keep adding to my collections, and I put a bunch of drawers up here because I've always got a bunch of little things that need a home. This one here actually just folds down. There's an outlet inside of it, and I've got a cable in there for, iPhone and iPad and stuff like that. So it's working out really well for me. I'm using an undersized plywood router bit along with the plunge router to cut the dados for my base cabinet. And this is going to be for the base of the cabinet. Something I've really been trying to pay more attention to is making sure that I'm sanding panels before I assemble them. I used to wait until after the fact, but I found it's so much easier to do when everything's flat before it's glued up. You can get most of your sanding done and then just go back and clean up any glue. I've been using the Domino for a few years now, and I never ever looked back. It's just been a great machine to have and to grow with because it keeps everything nice and clean, and it's very, very easy to keep things aligned, which is super important for me. The first thing I do when I'm starting this hutch is to break down the 4x8 sheets of plywood. I've been doing that with a track saw more and more lately because I find it so much easier than wrestling a full sheet of plywood around my table saw and through my shop. While I've got the tracks out, before I rip cut the sides, I grab the router and cut all my dados because the sides are still one piece, and I can cut the dados all at the same time. They're all perfectly matched, and the track is right there. Nice and easy. Glue up can be a little cumbersome by myself sometimes, especially with bigger pieces. So I try to use as many clamps as possible and, these little 90-degree plastic corner things. It really helps keep everything lined up. I'm doing the glue up in 2 different stages for this hutch. Because there's so many different pieces, and especially with the drawers, I knew there was going to be a lot of dividers. I thought it would be so much easier for me to just separate this out. So there's the lower portion, I can get that all squared up and let the glue dry, and then I can deal with the drawers and those dividers separately. Once the lower section was cured, I was able to figure out how many drawers I wanted in the upper section and go in and cut the dados for all the dividers using a router and track. Without a track saw, this type of cut would be way more difficult. I used 1/2-inch plywood for the back. I like to keep things enclosed and clean. It was awesome having the battery miter saw and the MFT because I could set that up right in the room I was working, and while the base cabinet and the hutch were down at the wood shop, I came up to the house and started building a leveling frame just out of 2x4 stock. And it was just awesome being able to do this right on site, keep everything nice and clean. Building a base this way allows me to level out the base or lift, or I don't know, whatever you want to call it, for my cabinet. It makes it so much easier than, you know, trying to level out a big cabinet and wrestle with it and everything else. Right now I can get access to everything super easy. I get it leveled, square it to the floor, and then put my cabinet right on top of it. The plunge attachment for the Vectoro is it's a lot of fun to use. I'm using it here to cut out an electrical box. I didn't know exactly where I was going to put the electrical box. That's why I waited until the end to do it. Once I had everything in the room and I could sort of take some final measurements, I figured out exactly where I wanted it. And this attachment's just pretty fun to use. It was super easy to keep square. I literally just clamped a square right to the cabinet and then lined that up with the base of the little plunge attachment. It was killer. Before putting the hutch in place, I wanted to make sure I could figure out where the studs were on the wall and get some reference lines drawn in there. And then I also cut a 2x4. I ripped it down to use as a support piece for the lower section of the hutch. Just I wanted to make sure that that bottom shelf wouldn't sag over time. I ended up using the battery-operated Vectoro a lot on this project, even for simple things like trimming off these shims. The KSC60 has really good cutting capacity, and I've also become used to the shadow lines for cut reference as opposed to lasers. It's a lot more accurate. To keep the trim corners nice and square, I'm using a domino to place dominoes into those bevel cuts, and then I'll glue it up and put it in place. That way everything stays nice and clean, and the 90s, as they start stacking up, as you'll see throughout the project, they're all in line with each other. Buddy's always checking in just to make sure the project stays on point. I made sure to use the domino before this lower section was installed, because once it's installed, there's not enough room for the domino to actually get in the proper position. I used 2 different widths for the stiles and rails, so I went ahead and ripped all that beforehand, and then I had everything I needed, so I could just start taking measurements and cutting dominoes and cutting everything right to length, right on site. I'll tell you, having everything right there next to me made the biggest difference on this project. So much easier than going back and forth down to the wood shop. I had some reservations at first about the shadow cut line on the KS60. I really like the lasers on the full-size Capex, but after using it for a while, I gotta tell you, I like the shadow lines more and more. They are way accurate and a lot easier to see. For trim work, it was really, really fun to use. I think for me, the best thing to do with building these face frames is to really just take my time with it. I double check my measurements. I try to actually take like a line measurement right on the face of the work instead of using a tape measure or something, because I find it just even a little bit more accurate. And I just take my time with it. I domino every joint and build it slowly and try to keep everything nice and square and tight. And at the end, it pays off because it looks really clean. I think if I would have had a table big enough, I would have, built that entire face frame and glued it up and locked it down on a table and, made sure everything was perfectly square, and then install it as one giant face frame. I don't know. I think it might have been easier to do that way, and it definitely would have helped keep everything square and tight. But I didn't have the space to do that, so I glued it up in pieces as I did. And, at the end of the day, it worked fine, but, there's always more way than one of doing things. I wanted the top of the hutch to be a little bit higher and change the relationship between the drawer faces and the top of the hutch, and to be able to use some additional trim and molding in there. So I used some spacers or some wood to just fill up the space to lift the height of the cabinet. Around the edge of the bench door, I did a 1/4 inch pine trim just to clean up the edges so you don't see the plywood underneath. To get consistent gap spacing all the way around, I used playing cards for shims. They work great because they're all consistent in thickness, and you can just count out the number of cards you need in each spot. I used a set of surface mount soft closed hinges, and they worked great. On the door pull, once I got the location figured out, I squared it up. I tried to remove as much material as I could with Forstner bits, and then I went in with a router and just cut the reveal out for the thickness of it. It's a little time consuming, but I got a nice clean flush edge on it. So this was a fun experiment. I got the top cut and ready to go. I cut some strips to put along the edge, and I got my face all done and mitered in. Everything was glued up and nailed with a whole bunch of nails, only to find out it was upside down. You live and learn, get disappointed, and then you move on. Since I had moved the top of the cabinet up, I wanted to make sure there was plenty of support underneath, so I did these vertical stanchions and a brace along the back and edge. I had to make 4 drawers for this cabinet. I decided to go with bottom mount slides, and I also have been using dominoes in drawer construction for a while now. They've been holding up really well, and it's a lot faster. On the top edge of the drawers, I used a 1/4-inch pine banding just to keep it clean and get rid of that plywood edge. All the drill attachments for these Festool cordless drills really make a huge difference. It's so much easier to get into tight spaces. I'm using MDF for the drawer faces. It's a product that I don't really use a ton, so it'll be interesting to see how well it holds up over time. Honestly, I'm not sure, but we'll see. For finishing, I decided to spray the cabinet. I did a bunch of tests on color, and I already owned a sprayer, so it wasn't a big deal. It's just a little bit extra prep. I primed it, sprayed the primer, and I also sprayed the finishing coat. I ended up using Sherwin-Williams paint and a semi-gloss finish. I replaced all the baseboard molding in this particular room, and I couldn't find the exact profile that I wanted. I wanted something that had a more of a nostalgic look to it and taller than what I could find. So I just cut my own. I just used the plunge router and a few different profiles to cut it all. And then I pre-stained it and cut it and installed it, and then went back in and touched up any of the areas I needed to.